Professor Massimo Faggioli, thank you for joining us on Common Home TV.
Thank you. My great pleasure to be back.
Well, I think my first question is, what are your main takeaways from the Australian Plenary Council? Did anything surprise you?
The surprise was that it arrived at a conclusion, because it is something that we should remember. Started years before Pope Francis announced the synodal process. It survived the COVID years. So I observed that with some attention, because I believe it is the most significant of all experiences of synodality that are happening in the Catholic Church at this time.
Well, how was it received overseas in the United States and in the West? Because you've just come back from Italy, so has it garnered enough attention, do you think, in the Catholic mind, in the Catholic media?
I think it has, even though I expected more attention in the United States for the Plenary Council of Australia. But as we all know, America tends to be a little insular sometimes. So these are two big countries, two continents divided by common language, to paraphrase. I don't remember who said that about.
That's a great line. That's a great line.
But I know that it has been followed with attention in Europe, and especially those countries that have gone through their national phase, like Germany and like Ireland, because there are many similarities, echoes of what were the expectations and the results of these different events. So I believe the Australian Plenary Council has been very important, because it has been a trailblazer, I think, in this phase, because so many issues in the Australian scene have become really one a few years before other churches started addressing this. Let's talk about the relationship between the church and indigenous culture, that has been covered a lot in these last few weeks because of Pope Francis' trip to Canada. But the church in Australia and the Plenary Council have talked about that much earlier, and I think more in depth at a general level than other churches. So that's why I think the Plenary Council has been followed with interest and curiosity, also to learn something, because it's been instructive for others who were participating in their local events.
Well, that's interesting. Without too much prognostication, because we're going to have discussions with people about the synodal way and in Ireland, but just from what was reached, the consensus is reached in the synodal way, the way that the way that the Plenary Council was formed, presented, and finally ended. What do you think that Germany or Ireland can learn from this? Is there any one takeaway where they could say, well, this is something we could learn in both either form, structure, or specific issues to pick up on and highlight?
What I think other countries have learned from Australia, and each country is learning from other countries, is that the issues that are typical of our situation are not just our issues. There are many similarities, many parallels in the issues that have been raised, have been addressed in different countries, different latitudes, different situations. And so that is experience of reassurance that we are not alone. So here, the Plenary Council of Australia clearly is a little different from other experiences like Germany and like Ireland, or because it's a council and not a synod, which means that bishops have a more authoritative role in a council like the Plenary Council of Australia than in a synod or synodal gathering. But what has been very interesting for me to look at is that since the very beginning, under the leadership, especially of Archbishop Coleridge, it was clear that it was going to be a plenary council following canon law. So where all bishops, only bishops can vote and so on, but in a synodal spirit, in a synodal way. So that was a courageous move. And of course, this means that in the end, the consensus that can be reached is not as high as the demands at the beginning were hoping for. Okay, so this is completely normal of an ecclesial situation where bishops have the majority of the votes, the decisive part. Okay, but as everything in the life of the Catholic Church, the contents, the decisions, the texts are inseparable from the way they have been created and addressed and discussed and voted, which means that the Plenary Council is not finished, that it's something that now has to be developed, and who knows what's going to happen to those final resolutions, final texts, because many of these these proposals, they are coming also from other churches. I mean, they concern the universal church, so they will be a very important input to the global conversation. So here, to be honest and on the record, I was one of the consultants for one of the documents that were part of this conversation in 2020, titled "The Light of the Southern Cross." And those proposals were much more courageous, I would say. And there's a difference between those proposals and what has been decided in the end by the council. But I'm not one of those who thought either the council approves what we have proposed or it's a failure. So here there has to be a certain amount, not just patience, but of understanding that the church doesn't work like a parliament where there's a bill and it's approved and that is applied like a law of a secular jurisdiction. Things work differently, and so we don't know really what will be the final impact of the Plenary Council now.
Well, I think that's something that we would like to address with Common Home TV, is to continue, because implementation is very important, right? So the Plenary Council itself, the scope, its actual ability to be written into these documents is great, but we need to continue on that path. So thank you for your time. I spoke mostly to the women about the role of women, and it was much discussed. But another thing that I find interesting in this is the role of men. Quite often, because of the church hierarchy, the role of men is seen as, oh, it's paramount. We have the priests and the clerics, and they're making the decision. What about the role of laymen, and how to further use, with a church which is shrinking in numbers in the West, at least, I think it's fair to say from census, from the younger generations, how does a council like this better incorporate the tools of men who are willing to give their gifts to the church?
This is an important question because at 60 years from the beginning of the Second Vatican Council, one of the highest points of the theology of the Second Vatican Council, which was the theology of the lay people in the church, clearly shows its age. It has aged, and it sounded an important breakthrough in the early 60s, but in reality, that theology of the lay people as such, as opposed to the clergy, being recognized as collaborators, was a theology of the 1950s. So it was old already in the 60s. It just sounded new. So we know now that there is a problem in the Catholic Church for women, for young people, and for men, what it means to be an active part of the church. And so here the situations vary very dramatically in different countries, different latitudes. But the question right now is, and I speak here as a man, as a white male, is that being a male in the church right now, you feel sometimes pressure to not to become too engaged, okay, because the real issue is women in the church. And so we might think that we laymen, we should just stay away and not offer our gifts, our talents, because the real issue is making space for women. The problem, I believe, is that there is the need for all different components in the church, included laymen, to find new ways to be involved. And so for me personally, it's really different, because as an academic theologian, as a professional theologian, I already have my role. So I am not representative, really. But there is a big problem. So when we talk about clericalism, which is one of the ills of today's church, it's not just something that concerns the role of women in the church, but also men. And so that is something that I believe is really part of the synodal project to rediscover ways for all members of the church to be active part. And clericalism should sometimes become one way not to address the issue of male participation. I mean, what kind of male presence there should be in the church, which is not associated immediately with the clergy or with the patriarchy or machism and so on. So this is one question that has to be part of the synodal template.
Oh, definitely. We can't fetishize one group. I find sometimes in secular society it happens a lot, but it needs to be, as you said, comprising of everybody. So making space for women is definitely something that I personally advocate for. But to hold that up as my one niche thing, I think, is to kind of put blinders on yourself. You mentioned Vatican II, which is a good segue into my next question, because you must have been just as surprised as I was logging onto Twitter to see Vatican II trending. And of course, it sparked a lot of debate from a lot of people, some learned, some not so much. What do most opponents of Vatican II get wrong when they weigh in on the debate?
So what most opponents of the Second Vatican Council get wrong when they talk about that, especially on social media, is that they identify the Second Vatican Council, that theology, those documents, that important event with anything and everything that happened in Western societies, Western culture, beginning with 1968, the 70s, and so on. And so as a caricature, of course. I mean, the Beatles, Woodstock, sex and drugs, and so on. So it's a caricature. So the problem is that often that reduction of Vatican II to a caricature of the 60s or the 70s is not just typical of some uninformed, influencer on social media, but it has become also the way some in the clergy and some bishops even think and say about Vatican II. This is something that goes back to the 1980s, 1990s, when a certain turn against or away from Vatican II started to happen. So here there is a vastly underestimated ignorance on Vatican II, included the clergy and some bishops, who barely know what those documents say, what they didn't say, what the Church has always done after Vatican II, after Vatican I in the 19th century, after Trent in the 16th century, to implement a conciliar teaching that is never totally complete. So this is something that I am worried about, because unfortunately it's not something that is typical of some ideologues or of social media, but it has become really a perception of some who have power in the Church, who don't want to hear anything anymore about Vatican II, because they associate Vatican II with chaos and with anything goes, with an abandonment of the practice of. So the post-Vatican II period had its problems. There's no denying that, but it is a simplistic way of looking at these last 60 years to say all these things happened because of Vatican II. They started happening in many countries, including Australia, in the 1940s, 1950s. I mean, people stopping going to church and so on. So this is something that was not caused by Vatican II. I mean, Vatican II put more attention on what was happening in the church. And so we started paying more attention to the secular lifestyle, diversity, multiculturalism, multi-religion. Okay, so that's now the synodal process is a great opportunity to rediscover what Vatican II was about, what Vatican II says about what we need to talk about in the church of today, and what Vatican II did not talk about. And we need to start talking about that, because the fact that a previous council didn't talk about something is not a prohibition to talk about that. Okay, so on some other issues, I mean, John Paul II, Pope Benedict have augmented, have developed Vatican II, so it is legitimate to implement and expand on some issues where Vatican II didn't talk about.
Well, in the spirit of Reformation, the next thing I'd like to ask you about is Roman Curia. Can you talk a little bit about Pope Francis's reform and how it differs from what John Paul II did with his reform of the Curia? And why is it so important now? Why is this part of what I feel in some ways in the West is a new spring in the church with these reforms and these ways of trying to better our community, our faith community?
Right. So in March, Pope Francis published the new Apostolic Constitution of reform of the Roman Curia, which is one of the most important documents of his pontificate, because it is a project that he started working on immediately after his election in 2013, because it was part of the conversations at the conclave that elected him. So it is an important reform that changes, something actually, takes the place of the Constitution, Pastor Bonus of John Paul II, 1988, which restructured the Curia in a way that was more in line in 1988 with the new Code of Canon Law of 1983. Now, Pope Francis' reform doesn't take as an inspiration the Code of Canon Law, but it takes a synodal model of the church. And so here there are many technical details in this very long document, but one of the most important principles is that the Curia, or the Vatican, works synodally, in synodality, internally, and with the rest of the church. Curia is at the service of the Pope on top and of the universal church on the other side. So the Roman Curia is not the dominus, is not the master of church governance, it's the servant. And that, it has always been like that in some ways. With this document, Pope Francis makes it even more explicit, more clear. And so there is a reorganization of all different dicasteries, priorities, and so on. There are some important elements that could be revolutionary, which is that lay men and lay women could be appointed in top roles in the Vatican dicasteries as prefects or secretaries, which is number 2 in a dicastery. So this is potentially very, very transforming, and we will know more about this because at the end of August there is the consistory of all cardinals that Pope Francis has called to Rome for a 2-day discussion of the state of the church, and particularly the topics of the discussion will be the reform of the Roman Curia, because the success or failure of this reform will depend much on the relationship that there will be between local bishops and the Vatican. So there has to be a process of change of mentalities, of cultures, of governance in the church that starts from the Vatican, but also reaches the local churches. So it's a very important reform because almost every pope in this last century, 100 years, almost every pope has made his own reform of the Curia. 1908 was the most important after the First Vatican Council. Then there was a break between 1908 and Vatican II. Paul VI in 1967 had his reform, and then John Paul II, 1988. And here Pope Francis, after 9.5 years of his pontificate, this is happening. After so many delays and interruptions, and COVID happened and so on. So this could really change the ways in which business is done in Rome for Catholics, which could have an effect also on the local churches.
Well, yes, because I guess it opens you up to a bigger pool of competent people once you allow once you open up a larger pool of people to choose from to be into these places. Do you think it'll have an effect on culture in the Vatican as well, having these people in these positions, having clerics in the Vatican work side by side with women, competent women and men in these new positions?
So that has started already in some cases. For example, in 2018, I think the dicastery for communication has a lay prefect who's an Italian lay journalist, and so that has changed things already. So I believe it's essential to have a mix of Italians and Italians, clergy, non-clergy, men, women. The problem is that if you hire lay people in the Vatican, you have to pay them real salary, which is something that is not true for most of the clergy. I mean, all of them, basically, they are subsidized by their diocese or the order. So in theory, that it is revolutionary if it happens at several levels. I think that at the beginning, it will be some key positions where lay people will be appointed because the Vatican doesn't have that large amount of money to pay salaries. I mean, people moving from America, from Australia to go to work in Rome. Also because in the past, we know that there were lay people working in some other Vatican entities, let's say that, and they accepted to work for the Vatican for a salary which was paid by someone else, which was not the Vatican. And that created a conflict of loyalties and of interest sometimes. Okay, so here it is very complex because there is an aspect of theology, of culture, of sociology, of money. I mean, human resources means money. So it is a very complex system, which in these last 4 or 5 centuries has survived thanks to a cheap labor of clergy and of the religious. When you want to hire lay people, that becomes more expensive. And so that is one problem that I'm sure they will talk about in Rome when this issue comes at hand.
Yes, I think we see that happening in many different apostolates now with the change, and how to accommodate that with fiscally is going to be a very interesting decade, I would say. But on behalf of everyone at Common Home TV, I would like to thank you for your time. Once again, Professor Faggioli, it's been a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Cheers.